Okay, so next on our agenda today is Dr. Lorna Hill. Lorna founded the social enterprise Sharing a Story CIC in 2019 as a direct result of her PhD research and work she piloted with survivors of domestic abuse. She is the senior project facilitator on the social leadership programme BOLD, which stands for Bringing Out Leaders in Dementia, here at Edinburgh and Queen Margaret Universities. And she's a trainer in first aid for mental health. Lorna is the author of 5 fiction books, and her PhD research has been published in academic journals and edited volumes. This afternoon, Lorna is going to speak to us about From Crime to Connection, how researching women in crime fiction started a social enterprise to empower vulnerable people through storytelling. Lorna, thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Alan, and thank you everybody. Thank you, Ian, for inviting me to speak. I appreciate this presentation might be a little bit unusual just in terms of the journey my research has taken me on. So I'm just going to share the screen with you. You can just let me know if that's okay. You can see it.
Perfect.
Okay, so because my journey, I guess, is a little bit different, I've tried to keep the narrative of it quite simple because quite a lot has happened in the last 9 years since I started my research. So it was in 2014 that I started my PhD research at Stirling University. And I was very fortunate to be awarded funding from the Arts and Humanity Research Council. And the title of my PhD was Bloody Women, and it was a critical creative examination of how female protagonists have transformed contemporary Scottish and Nordic crime fiction. So the critical creative examination with the PhD, the plan was to write a book, write a novel, a crime novel, along with my kind of academic reading of the way that things had changed. So what I wanted to really look at was this kind of rise in female writers, both in Scottish crime fiction and Nordic crime fiction, because really up until the mid-90s, late 90s, crime fiction had been very much dominated by male writers. So I really wanted to shine a light on the huge changes that had been made by the female writers. So Lynn Anderson, who I know is going to be speaking in the next segment, was a wonderful support and very generous with her time, talking about her female protagonist, Rona MacLeod, and her series. Val McDermott, again, she was another great person to speak to get a sense of her writing process and the way really in which the crime novel has been used to reflect what's going on in society. Now, we're probably all, really kind of quite familiar with the fact that crime novels usually been dominated by this kind of grisly police detective. And what these female writers were doing, they were starting to use female protagonists in quite a different way, and going beyond that idea of a protagonist being a police officer. So the kind of protagonist that I wanted to kind of narrow in and focus on was journalists that were used in novels. So Lisa Markland and her Annika Bengtsson series, Denise Mina and her Paddy Meehan series, and Val McDermott, she really kind of started this with her Lindsay Gordon series back in the 90s. And as I was reading these books and researching and studying, and now this was also in the kind of context of post-referendum Scotland, so it was just post-2014, and I know that Joe touched on a little bit of that earlier. But what I became really interested in was how crime novels can cross genre boundaries and focus on forgotten victims of crime. And at that point as well, my research became quite interdisciplinary because I started looking into women and the ways in which they were affected by crime, well, globally, but in Scotland in particular. So I looked at human trafficking, did some research with the Tara Project, which supports survivors of human trafficking in Glasgow and beyond. And I also was interested in domestic abuse. At that time in Scotland, legislation was being worked on and brought through that was quite groundbreaking in terms of making emotional, physical abuse a crime as well as coercive control. And that was quite radical at that time because it wasn't happening elsewhere in the UK. And that act was brought in, I think it was 2019, this new domestic abuse legislation. And Val has said, and I know a lot of Lynn will have said this as well, but the crime novel has become the novel of social history. Now that really has kind of resonated with me, and it really got me thinking about the way in which crime novels could reflect what was going on in societies and communities and countries at that time, and the links between Scotland and Scandinavia, certainly a lot of similarities in terms of the social and economic situation, political situation. So that really kind of resonated with me as I was doing my research and as I was writing my own novel. And because this is an academic project, there's a lot of words that I kind of started to think about, you know, making a positive social impact. There's a lot of chat around academic engagement, working with the community. And it made me really think about values and the intentionality of what it was I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it. And that got me thinking about social leadership as well. So during my PhD research, I had the chance to do some training with Maggie Gibson, who's a poet and has worked extensively in lots of different community settings, running creative workshops. At that time, Maggie was reader in residence at Glasgow Women's Library, which is a brilliant resource. They do amazing work. And she trained me in bibliotherapy, which is really around about how to set up a community workshop and how to approach it with different groups of people. So in 2015, I started a pilot project with Women's Aid East and Midlothian called a story cafe, using creative writing to bring women together. And when I started it, I was kind of taking a big leap of faith because I wasn't sure how it would land. I wasn't quite sure what the response and the reaction would be. However, fortunately, it was greeted very enthusiastically, and I've continued to work with Women's Aid since 2015. The women worked together, and they worked together to write a collaborative poem called A Dangerous Woman, which we submitted to the Dangerous Women project, which was being run at Edinburgh University at the time. That was back in 2016. And that was incredible to see the response and the confidence really that had been gained from these women, knowing that they could write. And one of the women said it gave me back my voice because she'd been given this platform to be heard. And then later that year, the poem was actually shortlisted in the Right to End Violence Awards, and the women were invited to the Scottish Parliament for the reception, which again was incredible. So some of this feedback that came out of that was, I really enjoyed coming together with other women, really enjoyed sharing our stories together. And it was amazing how many shared experiences we all had. I'd really like to do more groups like this. I was a bit worried about whether or not this would be my thing, but it was really good fun. It was more emotional than I expected it to be, but that was really positive. And another one said it gave me the inspiration to start writing again. So that was really pivotal as I kind of came to the end of my PhD research. It really made me think about what I wanted to do next. And working in the community was very, very important to me, making a small but positive social impact with people at risk of social isolation. So in 2019, I set up Sharing a Story, which is a community interest company. It's a social enterprise, using different creative workshops to work with different groups who might be vulnerable, they might have mental health conditions, a whole range of things. And at the same time, later that year, I started working for Edinburgh University on a social leadership project, developing the BOLD project, which uses creative methods to work with people living with a dementia. So both were kind of fairly helpful in terms of informing each other. Now, just after we set up, that was 2020, obviously the pandemic happened, lockdown, and that really kind of put a bit of a pause in everything until I kind of worked out how to move things online. And of course, now we're all working a lot more online, we're a lot more savvy and confident with it. But over the last 4, almost 5 years, I've been really lucky to work with lots of different community groups. So, as I said, Women's Aid East and Midlothian, I've continued to work with them. I've worked with disengaged kids, vulnerable kids at Heavy Sound, Dementia Friendly East Lothian. I do a lot of work with my local dementia carer support group in Dunbar, Stepping Out, which is a charity for people with mental health conditions. I've worked with Capital Theatres, Luminate, which is the creative ageing charity in Scotland. And then a couple of years ago, I was invited to be the storyteller in residence at the Fringe by the Sea, which is a festival in the summer in East Lothian. So I've always kind of had this interest in working with people who are at risk of social isolation because of their circumstances. And a lot of them have been impacted negatively by domestic abuse, by crime, things that have been happening in the world, you know, the cost of living crisis, etc. These pictures are just some of the freelance facilitators that I work with. So we don't get any core funding. So every project has to be funded by wherever basically I can find the funding from. So this is a National Lottery Community Fund project, and they've been brilliant and funded a couple of our projects. So up on the top is my colleague Adam Robertson. He is a freelance facilitator that works with a lot of disengaged kids. And Adam's been working with Heavy Sound, and he's also very experienced in working in prisons. So he's been in Berlin running creative workshops, doing filmmaking, again, empowering people to share their stories. And then down in the bottom left is Barbara Gardner-Rowell, who is the COVID memorial artist for East Lothian. And she's been working with people living with dementia in different community settings in East Lothian. This is a project that I was tasked to do for the Fringe by the Sea, working with Dementia Friendly East Lothian. And again, just creating that space for people to share their stories, which is so important. And just some more pictures of working with Heavy Sound and again with older people in Dunbar. And the feedback here has just, you know, it makes it all worthwhile knowing that using creative methods can make such a difference to different people and empowering them to know that they are good at something and they have got a story that's worth sharing. Again, I always like to thank the funders. We've been really lucky in terms of the support that we've had. Most recently, actually, a project that Amazon Literary Partnership have funded, again, working with people to build their confidence. And most recently this year, we were shortlisted for the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland Self-Management Awards, Self-Management Through the Arts, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's encouraging people to find coping strategies, coping techniques for self-managing whatever condition they may be living with. So encouraging people to do some creative writing, whether it's journaling, keeping a diary, writing poetry. So that was lovely to be recognised for that work. And then to go back to the beginning, the crime novel that I wrote during my PhD research, that was published in 2020. And I decided that I wanted to give the profits raised from book sales to the Tara Project, which is the support service in Glasgow for trafficking survivors, because of the support they'd been to me and the help that they've given me during my research, and also to the survivors of human trafficking in Scotland, SOTUS. So that brings me to the end of the kind of narrative. My email address is there. If anybody's got any questions, please do feel free to get in touch. But I will stop share and I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorna. That was well, it was supremely interesting. It was also very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
It's sad to know that we have people in this position in our society, but it's reassuring that folks like you are trying to help do something about it and turn things around. Now then, do we have any questions for Lorna? Maybe I could get things started. You said a lot of fascinating things. You talked about the change in tempo that we encounter in crime writing in certainly Scandinavia, Scotland from the mid-1990s, with the female voice becoming prominent. Could you give us some examples of the kind of changes you've discovered in your research?
Probably the main one is the number of women writers receiving recognition in the crime fiction world, which is, you know, as I said, there's been an explosion. It used to be dominated mainly by Ian Rankin and William McIlvany until mid-90s, and since then it feels like a more level playing field, hopefully. But I know that Lynn will probably touch more on that when she speaks, so I don't want to say too much about that. But it's really looking at it from a kind of feminist lens rather than the male perspective, which can somewhat dominate things.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question here from Jakob Stogod-Nielsen. What has been the biggest challenge setting up your social enterprise? And are there other organisations like yours in the UK?
The biggest challenge, I think, you're reminding yourself that you're always open to learning and taking a big leap of faith. And funding is always a problem. Funding is always a challenge. Said we don't have any core funding, so a lot of the work I do voluntarily. But I feel quite passionately about it, that it makes a difference. And yes, there are lots of social enterprises all over the UK. Once you go online and start delving into it, you'll be quite surprised. But it's all about making a positive social impact and reinvesting in the community rather than profit. You know, it's not for profit.
Thanks a lot.
Answers. I can see a question from Anne.
Yes. Do you want to answer it? Anne asks, you mentioned the Scottish writers you worked with. Were there any female Scandinavian writers who influenced your thinking and your work?
That's a good question, Anne. Thank you. So Lisa Markland, definitely. She very much influenced my thinking and my work because she was using a journalist protagonist. And I had a journalist protagonist in my PhD book as well. But also Anne Holt, Christina Olsen, and Kati, I need to just double check, Kati Capelto, the Finnish writer. She was very influential in her thinking. When I interviewed her as well, there was lots of things that really resonated with me. And that's a really good question, Anne, because I think it's always really important as well to highlight the work that you do as a translator, and Ian as well, because I sometimes feel that the translators get overlooked in this really important sphere. So I just want to say thank you to you both for the work that you do.
Thanks. We have another question from another Anne. I think it's another Anne on the question answer panel. Have any of the women from your WA work groups gone on to pursue writing afterwards?
So as far as I know, a lot of them have continued with their writing. I don't know if you mean, have they been published or have they written a book? Which I'm not sure if that's what you mean. But a lot of the community work that I do, which I've realised, it's actually the process of coming together with people. There's a lot of there can be a lot of pressure, can't there, to have outputs from the work that we do in the community and from creative work. But the biggest learning that I have had is the process of people coming together. And if you take the pressure away, a lot of funders obviously want an output, but if you take the pressure away from there being an output, it makes people more relaxed, and it's the process of being creative. And that said, there then is always some kind of output with the people that I'm working with. I hope that answers the question properly, Anne.
Thanks, Lorna. A question from Ryan. From your research, what key points would you like policymakers to take forward?
From a kind of feminist perspective, equality is really important. I see at first hand the way that women are impacted, particularly women affected by gender abuse and gender violence. I know that a lot of the charities and organisations that are working to support women are getting their funding cut. So a lot of their staff exist on a year-to-year contract basis, which is not great, because a lot of them are kind of working in very, very difficult circumstances, and they're affected by vicarious trauma from the stories they're hearing. And if you add to that kind of lack of job stability, it doesn't really help people that are trying to make a difference and do good work. So from that kind of third sector organisation point of view, I would like policymakers to really take that into account. They say that they do, and they have a lot of meetings about meetings, but when you're at grassroots level, I'm not really quite sure that they get it and that they get the importance of it. So that's a good question, Ryan.
Thanks, Lorna. We have a two-part question from Jean. Do you intend to keep writing crime fiction, or was that just part of your PhD project? And also, how did your academic work influence your fiction writing?
That's a very good question, Jean. So there's two parts. So yep, I've written 3 books in the crime kind of psychological fiction sphere. And interesting, another unexpected turn, I've written 2 other books that are completely different. They're contemporary books written under a different name. And that really came as a result of lockdown. After being immersed in crime fiction and research and actually becoming quite disillusioned with the publishing industry, I kind of stopped creative writing because I'd lost my love of it. So during lockdown, I tried to do a wee bit of an experiment just so that I could enjoy creative writing again. And that has led to a completely different number of books in a different genre. And the second book, the academic research, it will have impacted me.
There's a thing I click on to see. I'll have the video. There you go. That's it.
Just aware that I don't want to talk over Lynn.
Sorry.
Yes, so the academic...
Carry on, Lorna.
Hi, Lynn. The academic research would, of course, informed the creative book that I wrote at the end of it, because it was a creative critical PhD project that I did. So they worked hand in hand together. So thank you for that question, Jean.
Thanks, Lorna. We have another question now from Ian Giles. And Ian says, as well as changes in who was writing from the 90s onwards, stepping away from the male gaze, were there changes in who was publishing, translating, reading, etc., crime fiction in Scotland?
Ian, that is a bit of a challenging question. I would need to think about that. Thank you for writing that down, because I listened to you and it went straight out the other ear. Well, do you know, actually, because Lynn has logged on at this point, I might bat it over to you, Lynn, because you're a bit of an expert. Might need to get you to unmute.
Sorry. I didn't realise I was in so early. I thought it was in the green room, so my apologies for that. But if you repeat the question, I'll do my best if I have any knowledge of it.
Okay, Lynn. So the question is, as well as changes in who was writing for the 90s onwards, so the move, or rather the rise of the female writer and stepping away from the male gaze, were there changes in who was publishing, translating and reading crime fiction in Scotland?
You're talking about the 90s. Well, Rona came onto the scene, writing from a female perspective myself, sort of 20 years ago. It's interesting. In truth, one of the former ones, a big name for me was P.D. James, but that's not really the 90s because she'd been there a fair bit before that. And there were some big names in America as well. I think my knowledge is only really about the world that I entered with DriftNet. there's definitely since then, I would say, been quite a big surge in more female crime writers, or looking at crime writing from the perspective of a woman. I personally chose a woman because I happened to have taught a young woman who ended up becoming a forensic scientist, and that's why I chose her, because it felt different and unusual, and I was interested in seeing that from within the crime fiction canon. So that's not a great answer, but it's all I can come up with at the moment.
Actually, that was quite a good answer, Lynn, because that made me think of a time that I interviewed you, and we did speak about the fact that more women are reading crime fiction, aren't they?
Yeah, and you know, obviously, if I talk from the perspective of even audiences at crime fiction festivals, and my own particular knowledge of Bloody Scotland, probably 2/3 of the audience are women. So they're big readers, and when you go out to do, they're big readers of crime fiction. When you go out to the libraries, they also talk about that. And when you do events in libraries, for the most part, it is women who are in the audience. That doesn't mean that men aren't reading it. But there is a sort of strange thing, and librarians will back me up on this, is that women are perfectly happy to read crime fiction written by men or women. They don't differentiate, really. However, in my conversations with librarians, they tend to say that men ask for a male writer. And that's why they prefer to read male written fiction. And that, I don't think that's changed much, really. It's still there, which is why you got a whole plethora of, when women got published, they didn't use their first name. They used initials or something that could be construed as either. Yeah. And I know for a fact that some publishers are still asking for that to be the case. No.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you very much, Lorna. I think we're going to have to draw things to a close now. So could I ask you all, please, to virtually put your hands together and thank Lorna for her presentation, which was fascinating and wonderful. Thank you very much, Lorna.